get some more reaction to that comment and the road ahead, depending on how things play out in a province like Ontario. Dan Kelly represents small businesses across the country. He's the president CEO of the CFIB. Dan, good morning to you. I'll start with the conversations that you've been having with government officials right here in Ontario. What's the most recent dialogue that you've had?
Well, we spoke to Ontario's finance minister just last week about additional support for small businesses, making a very similar point that none of the support programs that the federal government and provinces have allocated are anywhere near sufficient to try to help small businesses, any business really, survive the kind of lockdown, the length of lockdown that we're experiencing.
They're busy, those businesses, just trying to deal with what's happening day in, day out right now. But I'm curious about the kind of conversations you've been having with some of your representatives these last few days. They see the headlines like everybody else. What have they been asking you about?
You know, it's a mix of optimism given that there is a vaccine solution on the horizon. The worry for most businesses is, will they make it until such time as there's vaccines in the arms of enough Canadians that we can start to return to in-person commerce, visiting each other, indoor dining. And right now that seems like it's still months and months away. I really worry that there is really no pathway to end the lockdowns that are popping up in province after province, measures like curfews in Quebec. Because it doesn't seem like they're having the same effect that they did in the spring. And if the case numbers don't come down and vaccines are still months away, I don't know how many businesses are going to survive, quite frankly. We at CFIB did an earlier estimate of 160,000 permanent business failures before the end of the pandemic. That's seeming light to me right now, and we're hoping to come out with some new data next week to estimate again how many businesses we believe will make it. But months of additional lockdowns, and we've got weeks in Ontario at minimum, there's going to be a ton of business casualties as a result.
So as you're crunching those numbers, just to be clear here, is it your belief that the initial estimate might end up being lower than what you find as a result of what's going on right now?
I really do worry about that. There are lots of zombie businesses, as I call them, out there right now, businesses whose future is just not clear. The actual number of business failures to date during the pandemic has actually been fairly light. We've seen some high-profile businesses close, some of our favorite restaurants or shops shutting their doors forever. But we think that we're just at the tip of the iceberg, and that as the spring rolls on, the debt is going to choke the life out of many of these businesses. Because you remember, if you're running a small operation, a small restaurant, retail shop, service business, even a small manufacturing plant, you've got to earn enough money to pay your current bills, and you have to try to make a dent in the COVID-related debt that you've inherited over the course of the pandemic. That we estimate as $110,000 per business. That's a lot of money for a business to unbury themselves from. So I really worry that we're going to see huge numbers of business failures, even with full utilization of all of the government support programs that are out there.
Is there an ability, given to your point, that there is already a plan to continue spending in a big way? I guess the question is, what is the most efficient way to spend that money to ensure that everybody's in a decent spot? Are there any areas where you think there could be a dialogue going on right now, maybe further address some of those key issues you think that are going to be crunch time issues for those businesses, maybe redirect some of that money? What kind of outlook are you looking for on that front?
Well, look, one of the things that we really need even in advance of that is a pathway to get businesses open again. We are really counting on governments. If we get vaccines in the arms of the elderly population in personal care homes and emergency workers, perhaps there's a pathway, even with infections remaining high, to reopen some of the shuttered businesses in the weeks ahead. And that's my first hope. Beyond that, though, there is a good support program for rent right now, for a CEBA loan program of now $60,000, a rent support program that finally is working. We need to make sure that those programs are working for everyone, because there are tons of businesses slipping through the cracks, like new businesses and sole proprietors. Beyond that, the big issue for a lot of my members, small business owners, we have 110,000 as members of CFIB across the country, is debt. And we're hoping that perhaps, Minister Freeland has already allocated $100 billion as an economic shot in the arm once the pandemic is closer to completion. Maybe some of that money could be used to take away some of the debt bills that businesses have had over the course of the last number of months. If that happens, more of them will make it. Business owners will say, you know what, I think the math works if I can get my customers back. And that's what we're recommending. That's what we're going to be recommending to the federal government in the days ahead.
You're saying a lot of things that do make sense, but we have a lot of people in the middle of a pandemic who have a lot of good thoughts and good ideas. When we speak to the medical professionals, and we spoke to one yesterday, his argument for really getting back to something similar to what we saw in March when it comes to really being in lockdown mode. And Dan, I would sort of editorialize by saying I think mentally we're in a different state now, because maybe we're a bit more skeptical on how this might affect us versus back then. But his argument was, if we have a true shutdown, it allows us to come out the other end in better shape, to not have these starts and stops and starts and stops. Now, I know for some businesses, whatever the outcome, it's not going to be pretty. But how do you feel about that? Taking the big pain right now so that we're not talking with you a year from now and still going through these same realities?
Look, I get it. The whole strategy of locking down retailers and even indoor restaurant dining service businesses, as it's been explained to me, is not so much about spread in those businesses, but to scare the public and send a message to them that they've just got to stay home. But it's not working. The public, even with a deadly pandemic going on right now, the public is not in the same headspace as where they were in March. Everybody was pretty panicked. And I think people are of the view that we need to try to manage COVID until we're at the vaccine finish line. Unfortunately, that's not what public health officials and governments are undertaking to do. Other countries, even the governor of New York, who is not afraid to lock down businesses, is saying the state cannot afford to lock down businesses because people need jobs to come back to at the end of the pandemic, and therefore they're starting to lighten some of the measures over the next little while. And that, in my view, is where we need to be to balance the health and the health concerns with the prospect of having an economy to come back to. But the government support programs are not going to be sufficient if we're going to lock down businesses. And so it's, as the previous guest on the clip you played said, if we're going to lock them people down and tell businesses you've just got to suffer until this is over, it's deeply unfair to expect business owners to eat the entire cost of that. And sadly, even with the government support programs, that's what's happening.
Yeah, it is complicated to say the least, and obviously some ultimately pay the biggest price surrounding it. Well, lots to watch for. Dan, we do appreciate your time as always. Dan Kelly, President and CEO of the CFIB